Welcome back to another episode of Please Call Me Crazy, brought to you by Free People Radio and now powered by our first sponsor, TireGet.com. That's TireGet.com. Freedom of movement. Support the movement. You have to buy tires from somebody. You might as well buy them from us, and the freedom of movement is exactly what the establishment means to take from you. TireGet.com. I'm your host, Royce White, and I am here in Minneapolis, the belly of the beast. Today we have another incredible family and friends episode. I told you guys that this amazing doctor would be back with us, and we're happy to have you back, Dr. Jensen. Dr. Scott Jensen is our guest for the day, for the evening, and we're excited to hear all about what's going on with you. We said when we left off last time, you were facing what appeared to be malicious, politically driven proceedings from the Minnesota medical boards, and it was being overseen by the Attorney General's office. Tell me where we are with that. Well, I know where we are. You escaped fire for now. For now, you escaped fire. But tell me how that whole proceeding went down as much as you can, because I know it took place in the last couple of days. We only got to see the headlines, but I'm sure there's more that took place behind the scenes.
Well, thanks, Royce. Thanks for having me back. And you're absolutely right. 3 days ago, we had our meeting with the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. And I do want to be respectful. I understand that each and every one of the members of the Minnesota Board is a volunteer. They're not getting paid big bucks or anything like that. But they, in the end, after a 90-minute, fairly intense conversation, they recessed for 20 minutes. 20 minutes when you're sitting there waiting for someone to judge whether or not your license is going to be truncated in some fashion or another is a longer time than you might realize. But when they asked for my attorney and I to join them back in the room, they were very quick about it and very expedient. And they basically said, we are dismissing all 18 allegations. They're done. There were no stipulations, no efforts at any stipulation, and it was over. It was over literally in a moment. And I appreciated it, but I was surprised because during the conversation I had with the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, there were some instances where I had to push back. I just couldn't, if you will, swallow hook, line, and sinker some of the things they were saying. One thing I won't forget is there was a comment made about, well, if there are facts that are assumed, that's the truth. And I remember looking at the author of that comment. I said, really? So assumed facts are the truth? That was hard for me. Another comment that was hard for me was someone said, you got to remember, Dr. Jensen, in the beginning, fear was everywhere. And I agree with that. Some of it I thought was manufactured. But then the author of that comment went on to say,
in the beginning of the pandemic.
Right. And during this meeting, the author then went on to say, you got to remember, none of us knew anything. And I thought, that's a problem. That really, Royce, at the end of the day, that probably could be argued that was the first domino to fall, is when we had an attitude that none of us knew anything. That's a problem. We know that we have a constitution. We know that political leaders frequently are more inclined towards power and control than they are science. We know that science lives and breathes, and that science isn't something where, at this moment, and all of a sudden I had some omniscient kind of understanding of something, and it's settled for the rest of humanity. Science is always three things and three things only, and we lost sight of that. Science is observing, it's measuring, and it's hypothesizing. Isaac Newton sat under the apple tree, and he watched as every one of those damn apples fell down. Then he counted to see how many fell down and how many fell up. And when he got done, he had 100 out of 100 falling down. So he hypothesized there must be something that causes something else with weight to come to the earth. And that's how we got gravity. That's what science is. We didn't have that during the pandemic in too much of the situation, whether you're talking about false modeling, whether you're talking about the way we are doing PCR testing with the false positives, whether you're talking about the way public policy was being reshaped in order to potentially ramp up the fear. I would tell you this, Royce. At the beginning, we knew a lot. We didn't know enough, but we knew a lot. And I'll tell you what I know now is when we have our next pandemic, I would suggest to you and to me and to everybody, if you want real analytic breakdown, don't look for the people who have letters behind their name. Don't look for the people who have MD or PhD behind their name. Some of the most thoughtful analysis of what we've lived through over the last 3 years came from people, common Joes, who know how to look at stuff, think for themselves, integrate information from other sources, and make their own conclusions. I think that the whole concept of PhDs and MDs running the show was problematic from the very beginning.
So walk me through a few of these, because I'm sure, well, look, we're out of the pandemic in some ways, but in many ways we're not. People are still coming down with COVID. And there was this entire, there was a confusion or a chaos that broke out in the beginning, and people didn't, let's say on the conservative side of American political discourse, at least, people were questioning whether or not the virus was even real. And that to me seemed ridiculous from the start. And part of that is because I spent a lot of time watching Bannon's War Room in the earliest days when the virus was actually breaking out in Wuhan. And I remember when Dr. Lee, who first sounded the alarm about this new coronavirus there in Wuhan and how he was treated, and eventually he ended up dying from COVID. So I don't think that, it's just a flu made sense from the beginning. But we're not out of the pandemic yet. Yes, the deaths and things have changed certainly in their trajectory and scope. But the real issue, I think, for many people is that the potential for another pandemic is there. And not only is it there from some type of, what do they call it, mutation, some type of variant from this coronavirus strain, but some others that could potentially come in the future, whether natural or man-made. So I want to get into that because a lot of our viewers messaged in and they were interested in what you saw in the inside around exactly what you were just talking about, false modeling, the false positive. Walk me through some of those that you saw and some of the problems you had with those from the beginning.
Well, you're exactly right regarding Dr. Lee out of China. He indeed was the one who sounded the alarm. I believe at the beginning, it was in December of 2019, that there were 7 patients that had an atypical respiratory infection. It was, if you will, evading identification. That in and of itself is problematic for us because we're pretty good at identifying if a pneumonia is such and such virus, or if it's staphylococcal or streptococcal, or is it Haemophilus, is it mycoplasma? We've really made a lot of advances over the last century. But in this situation, this was something novel. And he did raise this up the flagpole, if you will, and he was squashed for that. And for a period of time, he was missing in action. Nobody knew where Dr. Lee was. He did ultimately emerge back onto the scene. And then, as you mentioned, he ended up contracting COVID and died. I don't think there's any question about
He was only 35 years old.
Exactly.
Yeah, about 3 years older than me.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any question about the reality of the virus. There were people saying, well, we haven't actually seen the virus. Well, yes, we actually did. And we were able to grow it out in viral culture plates. But I think from the beginning, first off, was its origin. And I was dead wrong on this, and I want to be clear on that, Royce. I thought that this was most likely a virus that came from a natural reassortment of RNA in perhaps a civet cat and a bat and a human. There was a wet market, meat market, not too far away. That was what we were fed. It was about 15 months after the initial pandemic broke in January of 2020 that Robert Redfield, who no longer was the head of the CDC, came out and said that he could no longer, in good conscience, state categorically that the virus came from a natural reassortment, and that indeed he was starting to think that there was more and more credible evidence that it had indeed come from a lab. That really got my attention. And so I went back to the books and started read all the articles I could. And frankly, I have done a complete flip on that. I think that the data now supports a 95% confidence level that this did indeed come from a lab. Was it because of gain of function research, which is another chapter of this whole thing? I think when Tony Fauci told the Senate hearing that there was no gain of function research, I believe that if he was if he believed that he was telling the truth, then he had done a pretty good job internally of rationalizing it, because he commented on he had not been involved in research trying to make it more transmissible or more, if you will, virulent. Well, that's only two of the ways that gain-of-function research is done. One of the most important ways that gain-of-function research is done is to not necessarily tamper with the transmissibility or tamper with the virulence of the virus, but instead try to change the target population. If you go back to the 1918 Spanish flu, one of the most devastating things about that Spanish flu pandemic was that it targeted 20 to 40-year-olds.
Right.
We had soldiers coming home from World War I, crammed into boats and buses and trains. They survived the bullets and the bombs, and they died of the Spanish flu, which was an H1N1 virus, I believe. So I think when you look at who is this going to target, if you can take a virus that's inclined to target weak, frail, elderly people over the age of 80, and all of a sudden shift it so it goes after the population of 20 to 50-year-olds, now you have a bioweapon. Now, that isn't to say that it's not heartbreaking for every person that got very ill or hospitalized or died from COVID-19 over the age of 80. But nevertheless, one of the conversations we haven't had the courage to have, and I go into this conversation with some trepidation because I understand people will be critical, but neither you or I are the kind of people that are going to back off a hard conversation. So I think we should talk about it. One of the things we haven't talked about is not how many people died from it, but how many quality adjusted living years were lost. In other words, if someone like you at the age of 30 were to pass from COVID, we would lose your 40 productive years from 30 to 70. Mm-hmm. But if it's someone like me who's 68 and say I was retired and in frail health, it's conceivable that if I got COVID and passed, we might lose 2 or 3 years of, if you will, quality adjusted life. That matters. It matters a lot, because if we look at what happened, we panicked. We absolutely flipped out. We locked down businesses. We locked out kids. We locked in nursing home patients. And in the end, what we did was we ramped up mental illness. We ramped up suicidal ideation. We ramped up suicides. We took kids from 4 to 18 and messed them up. We took adults from 18 to 55, turned their lives upside down, mental illness and all these things that aren't going to go. These all literally were cultivated, and we will see the harvest for decades to come. And for what? Because of a virus that really did focus on, if you will, frail, sick individuals with multiple underlying medical conditions. In many of those situations, those people were probably meeting their demise sooner than they would have had to. When you look at what we did with ventilators, we were putting people on ventilators not because they necessarily had to have a ventilator to stay alive, but because a ventilator would make it easier for us to control the likelihood that they would transmit the disease elsewhere. If we stick a tube in them, we know then that the coughing and the spraying, whether it's aerosol or particle matter, is going to be limited because we've got it all confined. So we had ventilators being used.
Wait a second. So just to be clear, are you saying that the protocol, because I had Dr. Pierre Corey in, and we actually recorded that interview before I was all the way up and running. So that interview is kind of in the archive, in the vault, and we hope to have Dr. Pierre Corey back. And he was one of the first to sound the alarm that corticosteroids was a suitable treatment in the early symptoms of COVID or in hospitalized patients. And that ended up changing significantly from the time where he went before the Senate and stated his opinion on corticosteroids, and then it became the norm. Are you saying that the hospital protocol around ventilators was more aimed at trying to control the respiratory exposure for hospital staff and doctors?
I'm saying that it was one of the considerations. And in situations, had we known earlier how devastating using ventilators could be, we would have avoided them at all cost. But we didn't, because we did have a sense that we could control the transmissibility of this. So typically when you put someone on a ventilator, it's a big deal. Generally, you have to paralyze them because you have to stop them from helping us. We're going to do all the breathing for you. So our death rate usually 30 to 40% pre-COVID. In some of the Eastern hospitals, in the first 3 to 4 months, that went up to 80, 85%. In other words, you went on a ventilator, 8 out of 10 chance you were going to be dead. I had patients pleading with me, families pleading with me, please don't let them use a ventilator. There was a resident physician who came out and did a video, and he was ostracized for doing that. But he came out and said, something's terribly wrong here. We should not be seeing 80% of people die from the ventilator use. What ended up happening is we learned quick, for some, not quick enough. But what we learned was simply jacking up the pressure to try to force more air into the lungs didn't necessarily assist the patient. What we went to was, okay, we're going to leave the pressure down low so that we're not blowing out little, if you will, alveolar sacs in the lung. And what
Explain it.
Well, little alveolar sacs are like little membranous sacs, and oxygen will come into those sacs, and then on the other side of the membrane is a blood vessel. And so the oxygen can go across, catch onto a hemoglobin molecule, and then our circulatory system will transport that oxygen to all the tissues that are vitally dependent upon that oxygen. Well, when you just jack up the pressure, what you do is you blow holes through those little alveolar sacs. They're thin membranous sacs. They might most be compared to like a real fine filamentous jellyfish that you might see on National Geographic. Okay. So that's what we were doing. What we learned was we needed to keep the pressure down low and not blow those sacs out. We needed to increase the oxygen. Go ahead and increase it, not to 3 or 4 liters per minute. Increase it to 6 to 8 to 10 to 12.
But keep the pressure low.
Keep the pressure low. Mm-hmm. That's what we learned. And then we stopped having so many people die. That's why in Minnesota, where we had a period of time where everybody was screaming, got to have more ventilators, got to have more ventilators. Shoot a mile. We got ventilators on pallets that were never unpacked. We didn't need those ventilators like that. We panicked. Fact of the matter is, now what we know is, I remember one patient of mine, he's 85, he's doing great, runs his own business. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks in May of 2020. And the only reason he wasn't put on a ventilator was his family stepped forward and said, don't you dare. Don't you dare. When he finally got out of the hospital after two weeks and came to see me, he was on 12 liters of supplemental oxygen. 12 liters. Normally, you and I breathing here, we're breathing less than 1 liter per minute in terms of just the room air. So he was on 12. We slowly ratcheted him down. He ended up doing extremely well. And as I said, he has now...
He's 85. He was 82 at the time.
Yeah. So now he's 85, doing great, stubborn as ever. And the bottom line is that's one of the things that we just didn't do a good enough job. One of the things that happened at the Board of Medical Practice meeting I had, and I mentioned it earlier, was someone said, you got to remember, nobody knew anything. No, we did know things, but we threw that which we knew right out the window. In 2002, we had SARS-CoV-1. It didn't turn out to be nearly the epidemic or pandemic that we thought it might be. But what we did learn from that one was, 5 years later, people who had SARS-CoV-1, when tested, more than 75% of those, in some of those studies, still had antibodies. Well, that's a good thing. That means that natural immunity provided long-standing protection. We weren't being told that at the front end. Another thing we learned is we're studying, do masks do the job? Mm-hmm. And the data said no.
This was in 2002.
2002 to 2020. We had 18 years of data.
We were studying do masks work in respect to SARS-CoV-1.
And influenza viruses. Right. So we have OSHA standards. We had N95 masks. A lot of people say, well, what does an N95 mask mean? What it actually means is that for particles greater than 0.3 microns, that mask, if appropriately fitted, will filter 95% of them. So even 5% will still get through. Now, the kicker is that the COVID particle isn't 0.3 microns or larger, it's 0.1 micron, which means that you're not going to get a 95% grab. And if you look at the data, an N95 well-fitted mask will not filter 95%. It'll filter a significant amount of COVID particle, right, but it's not that good.
It doesn't hurt you, but it certainly doesn't do the job that they said it did.
You certainly would not want to tell someone, wear this mask and you can't get the disease. That would be fallacious. So you do not want to do that. But then when you start wearing handkerchiefs or surgical or cotton masks
then
with 5 micron
you're
pores,
in the dark.
Yeah, you're looking at a 15 to 20% filtration ratio.
Still better than nothing, but ultimately doesn't provide much protection.
Yeah, we needed to be more focused on protecting those who are vulnerable, the elderly. We needed to be having people have a chance and go in and do their grocery shopping from 8 to 10 in the morning, everybody masked, do it as much as you could, have people delivering their groceries. But the idea that we were hoarding toilet paper for a COVID virus made no sense. The idea that people would buy their groceries, wipe them down, and leave them in the garage for 3 days made no sense. I mean, we just went over the deep end.
I'm going to be honest. I'm a pretty anxious guy. You know, my struggles with anxiety, they're historically documented. And because I was early with War Room and I heard the reports coming out of Wuhan, in those early days, I actually went to Mayo. I actually was having what you and I maybe would consider psychosomatic symptoms.
Very real things.
Of COVID, because I was listening to the news and, you know, I probably maybe got a regular little cold myself, but I actually went to Mayo in the heart of the spike. I mean, people were going cold blue right there in the ER. Elderly people too, mind you, but they were going cold blue. And I remember thinking just a couple weeks back where my mindset was then in terms of making sure my hands were always clean, being conscious of where I was in proximity to other people, like the whole narrative, 6 feet. And I just start to reflect on the whole deal, like, and talk about it from a governor's standpoint and the state mandates, like, you can come into a restaurant and you can stand up with no mask, but when you sit down, no, wait, you could stand up, you have to have a mask on, but once you sat, the mask could come off. I mean, these types of things seem almost ridiculous at this point in the game, but were they always? Just walk us through like how, from your lens, being in the medical field, how did COVID ramp up and taper off? Was it, let's talk about vaccines, let's talk about transmission. I remember early on, they said it wasn't airborne, that this was droplets for the most part, or don't touch your face, don't touch your eyes, the whole deal. And then it was, well, the air around you becomes saturated, and that's how people end up transmitting the virus. Walk us through the trajectory here of this virus. What do we know now? What really happened?
I think that in science, things are seldom black and white. The way this virus appears to be transmitted now is indeed airborne. It isn't fecal oral. Fecal oral is the way we pick up diarrhea. We end up getting a virus perhaps on our fingers, maybe from our mouth, or maybe we use a restroom, and it comes from touching while you're wiping after a bowel movement or something like that. But fecal oral is one common mode of transmission for many diseases. Certainly not COVID. There was discussion of that, but that's not a significant method of transmission. And there's others where direct touch, if you touch a surface, you can pick it up. There's others where if you touch an open sore on someone else, on an open sore of your own, you could transmit it. We start to think about things like chickenpox and some of those diseases. Mm-hmm. But with COVID, what we've learned is that it's probably transmitted, it's airborne, but it's two ways. Large particles and aerosolization, which are tiny particles. Large particles are usually like 5 microns. A red blood cell is about 5 microns. People might say, well, how big is that? I really don't know what 5 microns is. Well, if you pull a hair from your head and hold it up to the light and see it, you can see that hair. That's 50 microns wide, approximately. So 1/10 of that is 5 microns, or a red blood cell. You can't see it with the naked eye. We have COVID particles get surrounded by water molecules, and they maybe get burst forth at 100 miles an hour from a sneeze or even a sharp cough. That's probably perhaps the most significant way we transmit it. And that's why it's so important for people when they cough and sneeze to cover their mouth and not let that, if you will, that sneeze eject, hundreds of thousands of large particles in a moment. The second way, cover your mouth.
As your grandmother used to say, everybody's grandma, cover your mouth.
The second way it's transmitted is there's some aerosolization where these particles they're much finer, much smaller, and because they're much finer and much smaller, they don't weigh as much, so they're going to hang in the air. Large particles have enough mass that they'll get ejected, but they will fall
quickly.
Gravity, just like Newton's apples. Mm-hmm. With aerosolization, it can hang suspended for much longer.
Okay.
And that's a big deal. That's why when we're concerned that a significant amount of transmission occurred in asymptomatic people, now you're basically creating a situation where you're saying, okay, you don't have any symptoms. By just breathing, you are aerosolizing some particles from your mouth. So you conceivably could be a vector for transmission of the disease, not knowing you have the disease because of the aerosolization. Now I think that there's been an emerging awareness that large particle transmission, coughing and sneezing, probably had a large part to do with the transmission. Ultimately, we're going to learn how much is aerosolization responsible, how much is the large particle. I think, again, sometimes we have to let science breathe so we can really get the data on that. Mm-hmm. If we find that large particle transmission is indeed the biggest problem, and if we could get an N95 mask that could be mass-produced and more readily fitted appropriately, that would give us a leg up, potentially, down the road, especially for the vulnerable. Mm-hmm. To me, where we went wrong was, again, we reacted out of fear. All of a sudden, we were telling daycare providers, you've got to keep that mask on 2-year-old Johnny. Well, try as you might. You literally have to hold 2-year-old Johnny down and tie that mask around him, almost as if you're harming him. Right. We saw those video clips. We saw
moms against masks.
It was just crazy. So I think that's one thing. It was the transmission. Another thing was the 3-foot versus 6-foot social distancing. In Europe, they've done more studies, I think, at least they had at one time, than in America. And I thought the studies I looked at, I thought the European studies were. I thought they were pretty well done. And in Europe, they'd always said 1 meter, which is 39 inches, which is a yard, which is 1 yard, which is 3 feet. Yeah. And all of a sudden, we were 6 feet. Okay, we're going to be ultra careful. Yeah. But then all of a sudden, if you remember, it was 12 feet. And then they said, well, if someone runs by you, they've got spiral vortices that can eject air a lot longer. So you better stay 32 feet away if someone's exercising. I mean, then we had Tony Fauci come out and say, 1 mask isn't good enough. Put 2 on, 3. I said, well, why don't we wear 10? Let's just really layer up. I mean, we got crazy. I think there's a lesson there. Mm-hmm. I think one of the lessons is life is fragile. And all the fear in the world isn't going to necessarily take away the prospect that we might not have it tomorrow. Mm. I mean, look at the 24 people plus that died a day and a half ago in tornadoes that ripped across Mississippi. I mean, those people woke up that morning thinking, another day? What am I going to do? What's tomorrow going to look like? It'll be fun this weekend to see my grandkids, and they're dead. I think there's a message there. And I think perhaps for me, Royce, one of the most profound messages is that if we're going to let the fear overwhelm us such that we say to the Constitution of the United States, for now, you're not as meaningful as you used to be. We're going to have to push you aside a little bit because while you, Mr. Constitution, want to protect the individual liberties of each of us, we're in a place right now where we can't have our individual liberties protected. We've got a virus on our hands. I think that if this had been an Ebola virus with a 50% kill rate, you wouldn't have been out there having to convince people that they should take a vaccine because for $100, people would have lined up around the block saying, hey, Ebola 50%. But we weren't there. Where we were was an infectious fatality rate in the vicinity of an aggressive flu year, 0.2, maybe 0.3. Some studies recently have come out saying there's going to be a 0.1% IFR, which is pretty darn standard for influenza. Now, I think one other thing, Royce, that needs to be remembered is we have had numerous mutations. So we've had a handful of variants. And it seems like each variant, now perhaps that's not quite true. I was going to say each variant progressively became less noxious to the human. And I don't think it was a smooth curve, but we certainly know that the difference between the Delta variant and the Omicron variant was substantial. So I think
Omicron came afterward.
Omicron is the one we're still dealing with now. When this virus mutated from Delta to Omicron, while we didn't realize it, we could breathe out finally. Because that was the beginning of what appears to be the end.
The drop-off.
Where all of a sudden, this pandemic was becoming endemic, meaning it's no longer this massive killer. It's now being embedded into our society. We're going to have coronaviruses every year. What a lot of people don't realize is we were having coronaviruses. This is the 7th one or so. We've been having coronaviruses for a long time, and they cause cold-like symptoms. So
9 out of 10 people would that can be overstated, I think. I would venture to guess that 9 out of 10 people, if you walked up to people on the sidewalk in the public, 9 out of 10 people would not realize how many coronaviruses we've been dealing with, and that this was just another strain within a family that had been let's make you finish what you were saying first.
Yeah, I understand exactly where you're going, because we are now at a stage where clearly COVID's going to be with us. COVID-19 is going to be a part of us.
Yeah.
But I think where you were going to be going, Royce, was the whole issue of, okay, we've had 6 or 7 coronaviruses we've had to deal with as a human race on the planet Earth. But this one seems to be manipulated. This one had an opportunity to kill more than 1 million people in this country alone. Yeah. That is a problem.
Italy was devastated by
absolutely.
it. And because of their demographic, obviously they have an older population, but they were absolutely decimated. It was tragic what happened there in Italy. And in China, actually.
And to leapfrog forward, this is one of the reasons why I don't think that we can, if you will, take some sort of forgive and forget kind of attitude. We need to audit and hold people accountable for what happened. We've had thousands and thousands and thousands of families whose lives were turned upside down, either by suicide, mental illness that emerged, a family business that was closed, a loss of all of their savings. They lost their home. We've had untold horrific stories of what happened to people. And it happened because of fear. The fear was born, it appears, of a virus that was manipulated. Yeah. And when you start messing with viruses like this, my understanding was the level 2 laboratory status that they had in the Wuhan lab, some of those areas should have been treated as level 4 labs. They weren't. Humans brought this on potentially on ourselves. Millions are dead. We need to learn that powerful lesson from this.
Well, and I want to venture into this because you're one of the few people with those letters behind your name that has that credentialization from the universities and from the professional medical field that I trust. I trust your spirit. I trust your soul around these issues in large part. Certainly by comparison, but I know you personally too. But let's venture into this because I'm genuinely interested in. I had a podcast. I think it was either my solo podcast on Monday or maybe it was last Friday. I forget now. I'm in the weeds, but I talked about the emergence of monkeypox all of a sudden and how strange that was. Monkeypox just popped onto the scene and now it's all but gone. And then there was this more specific to the homosexual male demographic with monkeypox transmission, which was really strange. Let's venture into the whole gamut of science versus spirit, the fear of death, right? Mortality versus morals. Because to me, it seems, even from listening to Dr. Fauci or some of the other experts, professionals, their theory of the case or their pitch, their excuse, you could say, the motivation of gain-of-function research in the general sense was, we don't know what viruses are coming. We know viruses have come and decimated the human population before, which is true. I mean, we can look at any number of the bubonic plague and many others, Spanish influenza, other ones as well. So now we're at a place now scientifically where we feel confident to be able to manipulate viruses for research purposes. But in that, there's also baked in the potential of being able to have, whether it's Fauci and there's a collaboration or not, I mean, all of that, tinfoil, we don't have to get into that. The point is that there are people out there who are malevolent, who are enemies of freedom, who are enemies of human life, that are smart enough to weaponize our fear, and not the fear once the virus breaks out, but the fact that we would even delve into trying to manipulate viruses and think that we could contain that. Just talk to me about the general morals versus science, the spirit versus science, and that slippery slope from a doctor's perspective. How do we know which things we should investigate and which things we need to leave with God?
Well, let me start out with the bad news first.
Okay. I like bad news first.
It's not going to get any easier. Yeah. The challenges we're facing are going to get more and more difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think it is an important conversation because we can sort of tell others that we're going to take the high moral road, and we might until we stop. So let's go back. I believe it was in the 1970s. There was a priest, a Catholic priest, and his name was, I think it might have been Francis Schaeffer. But I believe he wrote a book, and it talked about the fact that our science was speeding ahead of our ability to deal with the science ethically. And that's sort of what you're getting at. Is, okay, we've got science and we've got ethics. We've got science and we've got morals. We've got science and we've got religion. Well, the appetite for scientific discovery is part of the human race. It's part of our neurons and
it was bred
fabric.
Into us. It's a part of it.
And we're always looking. We're always trying to learn. Mm-hmm. So what you've got is oftentimes you have pure-minded scientists who are trying to explore the frontiers like Spock and Captain Kirk. But then you've got people waiting in the wings so that when that scientific discovery occurs, they're going to grab onto it and use it to translate into political power. I think that one of the biggest mistakes we make in the world of politics, which to me, politics is nothing more than trying to live within a community of people and solve the problems that you collectively face. What are you going to do with your stool and your urine water? How are you going to keep that separate from the water you drink, or the water you use to wash your clothes? These kinds of things are what we have to do. That's politics. Well, in the political world, we have certain inclinations, and those inclinations oftentimes end up at three spots. People want to do something to get more money, they want to get more power, or they want control. So those three things drive a lot, but the science might be more pure. So the science is addressed. We come up with the ability to harvest a stem cell from perhaps the area right underneath our belly button as babies from our moms, and we can grab from the urachus a stem cell. Then we can prod that stem cell into developing in this direction, that direction, or this direction. That might seem scary to you, and it might be something that you object to, particularly if I tell you I could potentially prod this into growing into a spare part for you. I could take a stem cell, grow a second organism that looks just like Royce White, and that way you've got spare parts if you need kidney, liver. Well, I mean, it's a long ways down the line, but we're moving in that direction.
No doubt.
So
that is scary.
You would say, well, we can't go there. We got to stop.
Yeah.
And then I would say, but you've got leukemia, and we haven't been able to find a match for you. But if I prod this stem cell and get it to go towards your erythropoietic or your white cell origin line or your platelets, because those are the three things that come out of the bone marrow: red cells, white cells, and platelets. If I could get you new bone marrow, I could kill everything in there you got in your system now, give you new stuff, and you're cured. Then you might say, gee, maybe we can do stem cell research.
Maybe we should,
yeah. And this is what's happening, I think. And so I think science sometimes gets bastardized by the politicians. But I think it's not unpredictable what's going to happen. And that's what I think Schaeffer was talking about when he wrote the book. We know that human nature likes power and authority, control, dollars. And so somehow we have to craft a system of scientific discovery and advancement and shield it from the politics. There was a guy named, I think his name is Raymond, Dr. Raymond, and he was the chief editor, I believe, of the New England Journal of Medicine for just many, many years, and he no longer is. But he made a comment some time ago that the research, the New England Journal of Medicine is just a highly touted, highly honored medical journal that gives us high-quality research to learn from. He said, and he was head of the New England Journal, he said, we're seeing big pharma take over our research. The research is being funded by big pharma. If the research that's done doesn't give the results pharma wants,
They get
what's
new
the
research.
likely? They get new researchers. So you want to give them what they want. So there were many things we tried to do
The
in medicine.
crisis of the randomized double-blind.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing we tried to do was, okay, before you'd ever get your data and your research published, you had to register it at the front end. And you had to provide the outcome, regardless of whether it showed what you wanted it to. So at least we'd get the front and the back. We wouldn't just have people willy-nilly doing all kinds of research and only reporting on the good stuff,
Right.
the stuff that pharma said, hey, job well done. So I think that we really need to have, this is why we need the everyday person engaging. We cannot let the outcome of science be left to people who are motivated by power, money, and control. And so that means we all have a stake in this. And human nature says certain things. Human nature says, well, if I don't have to do this task and you will do it and I don't have to pay for it, yeah, go ahead. We all have to be incentivized to participate, to try to leave the world a better place than we found it. When we govern ourselves, ignoring our basic human nature instincts, we're asking for trouble. So when we talk about a COVID virus, we've got to recognize that there will be people that want to use research for gain of function. There will be people that want to manipulate it. There will be people that want to do it just for the sake of discovery. And this is what happened with COVID. At some level, somewhere along the line, there was discovery as a motivation. At some level, there was money as a motivation. At some level, there was a bioweapon as a motivation. All of these things happen. We shouldn't have been surprised. And that's one of the biggest values we can take from what happened is we need to be smarter next time, because there certainly will be another time.
And I appreciate that. I agree with you completely. Let's go a little deeper into it and think of it this way. Or let's play with this thought experiment. If we all abnegate some of that self-governance in pursuit of whatever convenience comes from it, and chaos does ensue and crisis is afoot, is it incumbent on all of us to accept some of that mortality and that tragic fate that we may encounter? I mean, that's, this is a high level moral, ethical question about life and living and fighting for one's life and accepting one's death and mortality and suicide. And I know that's personal to you. It's certainly personal to me. I've had many friends that I've lost to suicide much too early, and also my own dealings with anxiety and OCD and mental health conditions, and the people that I meet who have the horror stories about their children and loved ones, husband, wife, mother, the list goes on. From a cultural sense, when you talk about these politicians and the mainstream media, they seem to be fine with rolling the dice with everybody's life. And then when the crisis is afoot, they pitch that they can solve the problem. And they pitch it with the same confidence that they did before the crisis was afoot. But we allow them to do that. I mean, we empowered the Pfizers to buy off the advertising of mainstream media in large part. I mean, a lot. I'm not saying that everybody at Pfizer is corrupt or anything like that, but what I'm saying is that Pfizer has an economic stronghold on advertising that to me seems a bit, it definitely makes me uncomfortable, but it seems a little bit unsafe, let's say. We talked about I just mentioned the double-blind randomized clinical trials where, like you say, Big Pharma pays for everybody out there who doesn't understand what I'm talking about. The golden standard of research for Big Pharma medicine is double-blind randomized control tests, but they're expensive, especially if you're dealing with a drug that's going to go to market, at scale. The only people who can actually afford to run these research double-blind control randomized tests are Big Pharma, and so they have a hand, a spoon in the stew that isn't always based on the interest of the American people. My question to you is this: at what point do the American people, or free people anywhere around the world, at what point do we understand that when crisis is afoot, we don't necessarily have the right to mask a young child a 3-year-old because we're afraid of our own fate. We should accept some of that fate because we enjoyed the spoils of a modernized, technocratic, scientific culture.
Well, now that's a fair amount to unpack, but I'll take a shot at it.
Okay.
First off, I think that we should define the terms.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a randomized double-blind study mean? That means that you need to double-blind both the patients who are receiving, let's say we're going to study a new antibiotic to determine whether or not it cures streptococcal pharyngitis or strep throat instead of 7 days of treatment or 10 days. Can it cure it in 3 days? So we'll design a study. One arm of the study will be here, one arm will be here, and both arms will not know what they receive. This group may receive either a placebo, and this group will receive the study drug, or they might go, this group will receive the standardized treatment, amoxicillin for 10 days versus the new study drug for 3 days. You have to blind the administrators of the study as well, so they don't know what they're giving. So the double blind is the people receiving the pill are blinded, the administrators of the study are blinded, and it has to be randomized. You can't cherry pick the number of people you put in this group that are 20 years old and healthy as a lark, and these are all 10-year-olds with asthma. You've got to make it randomized so that you get, hopefully, a reasonable cross-section in each arm of the study. That's what we're talking about. So they are expensive and they're time-consuming. But we used to be able to do these studies through universities, often through private industry, but it wasn't always big pharma. The momentum has shifted. Big pharma really has their foot in the door. They know how to play the game. They know how to pitch the research they want, and they know how to pull the strings, if you will. And so I think that's where we're at. You mentioned that something about we all know, or we've all contributed to where we're at. I would say not. I would say that there's an awful lot of everyday people who vote for the representative or senator or whatever, who they choose, expecting them to
represent
and vote and do things in their best interest.
Be honorable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening is we're seeing that temptation is a real thing. It doesn't always have to be an apple in the Garden of Eden. And that when big pharma is there tempting, coaxing, I mean, why is it that so many of our political leaders go in with average net worth statements and come out very wealthy? I mean, they're not getting paid salary-wise enough to advance their wealth to the level we're seeing. It doesn't pass the smell test. So I think that
Kickback city.
Kickback, inside information. By the way, this company's going to do this next week because this committee just said this company gets to do this. This is going to spike the stock. I mean, who knows? The bottom line is, if there's a diamond in the rough in terms of a lesson to be learned from what we've gone through with COVID, it has to be that we can't let big technology squash the voice of Royce White. We need to make certain that you get to speak. We can't let someone come at you and say, you spread misinformation. And you say, what do you mean? And someone says, well, what you said a month ago has been proven to not be true. And you might say, okay, well, what I said a month ago, I thought to be the truth. And if it's been proven not the truth, I get it. Okay. Yeah. I get it. But that's so drastically different from disinformation. Disinformation is the deliberate attempt to mislead with false information. We have to make a distinction between those things. Have I been guilty at times of spreading misinformation, information that I thought on a Monday was true, and maybe by Friday I'd seen enough data that said, gee, I don't think it is true. But that's a whole lot different than disinformation. And I think we're being given disinformation by some of our leaders. I think when you have in January of 2020, you have two scientists independently saying that it looks to them like the virus came from a lab, and both of them have a conversation with Tony Fauci, and within 2 weeks' time, they've both changed their opinion. And a few weeks to months after that, both of their research labs were given millions of dollars in research dollars. This is problematic. And this has been well established. This isn't conspiracy theories. This is documented data by high quality legacy media sources in many situations which lean left. So when we see this happening, that's why I say we've got to have audits. We have to hold people accountable. America is suffering. Our democratic republic is at risk. And the only way we can get this kind of thing done is to have this kind of conversation where people get to participate and say, hey, I want to understand this. I mean, you asked me earlier, what are some other things that happened? Well, when we really needed to jazz up the fear, what was one of the things we did? You always want to accuse someone. When you accuse someone, everything changes. You look at your neighbor differently. You get a snitch line, you call up the government and say, hey, there's 8 people and they're having a barbecue on a deck and they're not wearing masks and they're not 6 feet apart. When you can turn people against one another, now you've really got things cooking. We saw that happen. We saw people being encouraged to snitch on each other. We saw the government come in saying, we can do contact tracing without you participating. You don't have to worry about calling us. We got your phone. We know where you are, and we can trace where you've been. So if we find that you have COVID-19, we know where you were the last 24 hours. We don't even have to ask you if you went and visited your boyfriend or your girlfriend. These are scary times. If we're not willing to say, yeah, this kind of stuff happened, if every time someone says that, they have to go through the gauntlet that Dr. Scott Jensen went through, where he's been investigated 6 times, then who's going to say it? Are you just going to wait and leave it up to 68-year-old doctors who are at the tail end of their lives? Are you going to take the 30 to 40-year-old people and say, you don't dare because you've got so much to risk?
Yeah.
That's where these partisan activists who weaponized the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice went wrong. They came after me. Well, they picked the wrong guy. I'm not young. I'm not gonna knuckle to them. I'm a skeptic from the beginning. I believe in context. I have access to information other people don't have. I'm convinced that I've been entrusted with the responsibility to speak for all people. And if I get myself in trouble, and if I find myself becoming pen pals with the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, so be it. I am not going to shut up. Yeah. This is my job. This is why I'm in the position I'm in for such a time as this.
Let's switch gears a little bit if we can. Because, you are a great doctor, and I trust your medical opinion greatly, and you've certainly sacrificed a great deal, and I'm happy, and I'm sure all in our audience and all of your followers are happy that you made it through yet another kangaroo court proceeding for the Minnesota Medical Board and came out Teflon. We might have to start calling you the Teflon doc here. Let's switch gears because much of this is political. I mean, we know how the science works. We know how medicine works. We know the dangers there. Technology and morals and ethics is a slippery slope. The political is a whole different ball game, influencing a lot. But let's talk more political because we're living in a time where political headlines are everywhere. We have a world war that is propositioned. There's a proposition of nuclear exchange even there and between Ukraine and Russia. We have Donald Trump making the headlines again, who is kind of the de facto face of the Republican Party in this country, at least from a public figure wise, and many other political headlines. None other, the Crown Act, if we want to go local here, that Crown Act was passed a little while back where Black women can wear their natural nappy hair in the workplace without fear of discrimination. I thought that was kind of somewhat of a dig on Black people politically, given what Governor Walz and everybody else there does to undermine us. But let's talk political. You were a very, very special candidate in the Republican Party. And you were a special candidate because you come from the medical field. You already had some experience in politics, being in the state Senate. But you also were a detractor from the mainstream narrative. But you were also pretty middle of the row on a lot of other things. Talk about your governor candidacy, if you can. I'm interested in it genuinely, personally, because I came through in a Congress race at the same time as you did against Ilhan Omar, and I saw the inner workings of the Republican Party. Where does the Republican Party go from here? You came up against a Kendall Qualls who was put up by the machine, and I want to make it clear for everybody. This is my opinion. I'll let you speak for yourself. But you were not put up by the machine. You were somebody who had all of the appeal for the machine to try and latch on to if they could. But if they really had their choice, they don't want a doctor who's speaking out against the medical practices and ethics and the way that you did. But you were so compelling. You were such a good speaker. You were so personable. You were had this honest persona about you that the malevolent actors looked at you and said, well, if we can latch on to him, we will. But Kendall Qualls was more genuinely put on by the machine. And I mean on the background from a fundraising standpoint. You raised a bunch of money from a grassroots initiative that really started on the ground. And I know your people behind the scenes, and I know the work that they put in to position you the way they did in the governor's race. Walk me through the Republican apparatus here in Minnesota and as you see it on the national scale.
Well, I think the Republican Party is in danger across the nation, but I think in Minnesota particularly, I think its brand is broken. I think the Republican Party says it's this, and this, but I think it's perceived by many to still be basically a lot of middle-aged to advanced age white men who have made it in life, if you will, from a financial perspective. We have got to be going back 150 years and say, what was Abraham Lincoln like? I mean, he did emancipate the black people.
100%. That's not arguable.
He was we the people.
Yeah.
I honestly think that the Republican Party is broken, and I think I was really disappointed to see both the leader of the Democratic Party and the leader of the Republican Party send a letter to the legislature encouraging them to make it more difficult for third parties to get a foothold. In order to become a major party in Minnesota, you have to have 5% of the vote in a statewide race, and they want to raise it to 10%. Well, the average across the nation that's necessary in a statewide race to become a major party is 2%. We're 5% now. They want to increase it to 10%.
So Minnesota's going out of its way to
make it harder. That's why Jesse Ventura went down and testified, says, why are you trying to make it impossible for a Jesse Ventura to get elected? Because Jesse Ventura came from a third party. I agree completely with Jesse Ventura. So when I was in the Senate, I mean, I broke so many rules, and I think that's why the party elite wasn't really interested in me being the candidate for governor for Minnesota in 22. I said we should talk about marijuana. I was clear I didn't think we were ready to legalize recreational marijuana, but I also said very clearly, if you're a black kid and get caught with a joint in your pocket, or you're a white kid that gets caught with a joint in your pocket, you have an 80% chance as that black man to have the full force of the law come down on you. And if you're white, you have a 20% chance. That's wrong, and we should fix it. One way to fix it is decriminalize it, make it a petty misdemeanor. And another thing we can do is expunge your records. If you don't have anything similar on your record for another year, erase it. I don't want it on your record when you go to apply for a job somewhere. We couldn't have a conversation in a Senate controlled by the Republican Party. I couldn't get a conversation. Another bill, I said—
Who was in charge of the Senate at the time?
Well, at the time, Paul Gazelka was,
okay.
and he wanted to play it safe. And I said, we're not here to play it safe.
And when you say play it safe, you mean he wanted to play it safe to the Republican base?
Yeah.
Or was it the RNC nationally? What was?
It wasn't. The RNC wasn't telling us what we had to do because some states were doing it.
Okay.
We basically had the attitude, if you talk about it, the next thing you know, it'll happen. And I said, no, that's not the way. You can talk about it, and it doesn't have to be inevitable that it'll happen.
Okay.
I remember voting for an amendment on the floor of the Senate that was proposed by a Democrat to try to make sure that all 87 counties would have access to insurance plans, health insurance plans for small companies and individuals. And there were the big insurance players that decided they couldn't provide plans for every county. They could only do it for 75 of them or something. There were going to be 12 or 15 counties that didn't get access. And so there was an amendment put on the floor, and it said, okay, if counties don't have access to small business plans, then those counties get to buy in at market rates into MinCare. Well, that's anathema for the Republicans because they say, well, that's a foot in the door. Now you're going to end up with single-payer healthcare. Well, I don't support single-payer healthcare, but I do support pushing back against the insurance companies. And so I voted with the Democrats on that amendment, and the amendment failed. But I did this enough times that there were people who said, Doc, there's no way in hell that you should be the candidate for the Republican Party. They're going to come against you. And they did. But what made the difference was the everyday person. I mean, it was grassroots. I remember Mary and I going to 12 cities in 5 days in northern Minnesota. The last city we were visiting was Virginia. Mm-hmm. And Mary was tired, and I was tired. It was a Thursday night, and I said, sweetheart, we're going to spend 30 minutes with 30 people, and then we're going to get on the road, drive back home into Carver County. It'll be a 3 or 4 hour drive. You can nap on the way home. But, you've done great. Hang in there. One more place. We drive into this restaurant, and the parking lot's full, and I thought, gee whiz, we hit a busy night here. I found a parking spot on the grass, and we're walking into the restaurant to try to find where we're supposed to meet. I figured we'd be in a back room having this small meeting, and my wife looks over, and there's this great big pole barn, and there's just buzzing coming from it, and you can hear lots of noise, and she looks over, and she sees a ton of Jensen signs spanning the entrance, and she said, I think I know where you're meeting. We walk over there. There's 350, 400 people crowded in. Wow. They wanted to know something about me. They said, you're different. You don't really care. You don't follow the rules. And they're right. And that process went across the state. When you look at the map of Tim Walz versus Scott Jensen, the geography-wise, we had 85% of the square miles of Minnesota our way. But Tim Walz had the densely populated areas, and he won. He and his team did a good job of using the money that they had, and they buried me on a couple of issues, and they did exactly what politicians do. But that's what happened, and so.
And what was the spread? What was the spread again?
7 points.
7 points.
7 points, and I actually had about the same percentage of votes that Tim Pawlenty had in 2002 when he won. Mm-hmm. But the Democrats had leaned hard on Corey Heppola. Corey Heppola was going to run as an independent or in a third party, and all of a sudden he disappeared. Well, the reason he disappeared was because he was leaned on by people saying, all you're going to end up doing is you're going to be a spoiler. Mm-hmm. Is that all you want? You want to open the door for Jensen. So all of a sudden, Corey Heppola, with all his vim and vigor when he announced his candidacy, he was gone. Never to be heard from. I never saw the Star Tribune doing any tough, hard-driving, in-the-weeds interviews with Corey Heppola. Tell us why you withdrew. Tell us why all your fanfare didn't turn into a real live campaign. We never heard that. We know what happened. This is politics, and I get it. It's fair and square. It's playing within the rules, but the people need to understand that. So running for governor for me was not something that I'd ever envisioned doing, but in the end, I felt like I was sort of being called to do it. COVID-19 really, really bugged me the way we were making decisions. I thought we were seeing the everyday person just get treated like a lamb led to slaughter. And I said, I'm not letting this happen. And we said over and over again in our speeches, for such a time as this is why we're in the position we're in. Grateful to do it. But in the end, if there's one blessing that I think came from our campaign, I think that I've had so many people come to me, Royce, and they said, Doc, I know you lost. I felt bad about that, but I got to thank you for giving me hope. Mm-hmm. And I think COVID-19 was a tough time for everybody. And I think our campaign did provide some hope. We were off the wall. Matt Burke and we had a lot of fun. We did a lot of laughing.
That's great.
But that's politics. And I'm hoping that the people that got engaged because of our campaign stay engaged, because we need the everyday Minnesotan. They are the ones that are going to inject that common sense. And as you and I were talking before, Royce, about the whole concept of the ethics versus the science. If we're going to have the ethics managed in a real way, and I think you mentioned that part of that means there's got to be a common sense approach that life is fragile, and none of us have a guarantee that tomorrow's going to come around.
And my only point to say that wasn't to just kind of pound on the American people. I am hypercritical of us all, and especially the Black community and my own community I came up in, because to me it seems like there are decisions that are being made on our behalf that would appear to be done in secret, but when you really start to page through, it's done right out there in the open. I mean, the language may be manipulated and the jargon may be hyper political at times, but sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes they come right out and say, we're increasing the interest rate. The little guy's going to get smashed here by the Fed, right? I mean, that happens. But my only point in saying it was, let's be proactive. I mean, let's be active and involved. I said this the other day on my podcast, and I want to ask you about this as well, to pivot just slightly, because we are both a part of a party that has been branded and painted as a party of racism, white supremacy. And whether it be you from Sleepy Eye or whether it be me from the Rondo community, we're both on this side of the aisle and we're saying, wait a second, this is not what this party represents. And I've been here now for a year and some change, always been more conservative. I come from Catholic Frogtown. A lot of them are Democrats, but I believe in God, and my Catholic tradition certainly doesn't line up with the Democrat platform at current, nor did it since Kennedy was killed. But we are in a party where the branding is they're racist, and we have to contend with that. And we have to. And I'm going to say this, and a lot of my listeners aren't going to like it. A lot of people aren't going to like it. We are still dealing with racism in the Republican Party, and not the type of racism that gets painted on Rachel Maddow. And it's more the Gazelka type, right? It's like a passive. And my criticism of the Gazelkas, and I've met Paul, and Paul is fine. I mean, I got my criticism, but I met Paul. He seems like a good guy. Why are we so shy? Why? And there's a line there where our fear or our insecurity or our self-doubt or our true corruption of race, whatever it is, all it adds up to is that in a place like CD5, a Scott Jensen, who is a 10 times better candidate than Tim Walz, can't get the votes he needs in the highly populated, dense areas of the state, which is happening all across the country. Now, there are those out there who would say, well, what about the ballot harvesting and some of the other things around election integrity? And we should always be conscious of election integrity on both sides of the aisle, I think. But what do we do about the brand of the Republican Party being racist, and the fact that it really, when you go to these congressional districts, you go to the congressional district, what are they? The
BPOUs,
the BPOUs, and just all of the meetings and the things like that. You see that it's predominantly older white people. How do we really contend with that? I really wanted to ask you, like, going forward and what you saw from this election, how do we contend with the Republican Party being painted as racist when we know a lot of us that are involved in the party don't condone racism? They're not racist. You're certainly not a racist. But there is that element. I'll ask it another way, and you figure whatever way you want to answer it. There is an element of people who vote Republican who are flat out racist, right? Is that portion of people in America so big that we can't sacrifice cutting ties with them and going after more, not becoming Democrat, not conceding to the CNN, MSNBC narrative about racism, but there are people out there who don't even participate politically, that we are stopping ourselves from getting to vote because we want to attach ourselves to whatever genuine racism is left in the party?
Basically, I think what you're asking is, what's the recipe? What's the plan or the map to reconstruct the Republican Party to once again be we the people?
Yeah.
I think we have to, at some level, we have to be more affirming of other people. And we need to expand that movement. And I almost feel at times we'd be better off if we didn't use the word Republican and just talked about conservatives. Yeah. And remind people that the word conservative comes from Latin conservare, which means to safeguard. We're trying to safeguard those things that we think gave America birth: faith and family and freedom and the foundational wisdom of our founding fathers, honor life, yeah. And limited government, but understanding that government is a necessary thing. These are some of the things we have to do. I think we need to remember the lessons of COVID, but we need to honor whoever says it right. And we don't do that. Last week, I was called by the Star Tribune about a bill that Senator Dr. Elise Mann is carrying on non-compete clauses for physicians and things. She's carrying the bill. She's a Democrat. And they said, you spoke to this issue in 2019 when you're in the Senate. And I said, yes, I did. And I couldn't get a darn thing done because the Republicans held me back. Dr. Mann and I worked together. She was in the House then. What she's doing now is important. It's appropriate. And I support her completely. Well, nobody wants me to say that because Senator Mann might use that at her next election. See, Jensen approves of me, so you should vote for me. So we don't honor the words and the actions of people because it might help them down the road. I say frequently that the Republican Party is its own worst enemy, and I think it is. I said that we should have a conversation about marijuana. I said we should have a conversation about health care for all. I'm not worried about having these conversations. One of the biggest problems we have in politics today is people don't want to have hard conversations about ideas. They want to play it safe. It was Mike Freeman, I think. He was the attorney general, or he was the Hennepin County attorney for quite a while. Yeah. And I think he's a Democrat. But he had some common sense stuff that he made. Ryback was mayor of Minneapolis. I think he leans left. But he made a lot of smart comments. He had a perspective that needs to be considered. I remember I got in trouble because I was willing to have a conversation with John Thompson, and John Thompson was a Democrat and had gotten himself in some trouble with some polarizing language. I get it. But if he's in the House of Representatives, I'm in the Senate, and we're both elected by people, we should have conversations. Right. This is where we've gone wrong, and this is, I think, one reason why people were attracted to me. They could tell I didn't really give a damn about playing by the rules, and I still don't. So for me, people say, are you ever going to run again? I said, yeah, I don't know. But if I did, I'm not even sure what party. I mean, frankly, I want to elevate the third parties. I think the idea of a reform party, an independence party, a libertarian party, they bring a lot to the table. But right now, the Republican Party is broken. People see it as a group of elitists, and it's got to stop. And if we had one mantra that should control the way the Republicans start to behave, it's got to be we the people. It has to be we the people. And the people means you got to be colorblind. This cannot be about white supremacy or white racists. We can recognize that our system has a tremendous amount of unfairness in it. And where we see unfairness, we should try to fix it.
Yeah, and you know, I want to echo that sentiment 1,000%. And people give me flack. As I came into the movement, people gave me flack because I led these protests with George Floyd. And my protest wasn't all police are bad or George Floyd and all black men are victims of racism, because that's not true. Categorically, that's not true. Or any of the narrative that mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC was pushing. I wanted to say, don't let tragedy and fear hijack a moment when we all take away from the great material high that we've developed in the society to come together and talk about issues like you're saying. It's not only politicians that don't want to talk about issues. We, the people, have a lack of interest in genuine, deep issues. It's kind of like ignorance is bliss for many. Is, oh, that's too deep. I don't want to go there. Don't need to go there. It's too much stress, too much to think about. I always was a person who was interested and curious about issues and therefore, love conversations about it. Hence why I started a podcast. But I took the same heat can't tell you how many people I had email and call me running against Ilhan saying, why'd you lead those protests for George Floyd? He was a crackhead. He was a criminal. He died of fentanyl or whatever the story was, whatever they heard on Hannity, right, or wherever they were listening. Doesn't matter, really. Maybe it was K-Fan. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But I just said to people, I go, well, where were you? You had an opportunity to come out and voice your opinion. You could have made a counter protest. You could have stood up on the soapbox and said whatever you felt you needed to say at the time. Many of them claim to be Christians, and I told you last time there's a serious epidemic of 501c3 Christianity, right? And I was like, why didn't you come with your Bible? If you thought that all these green, purple-haired, young white liberals were possessed by demons, why didn't you come and exercise? Why didn't you come and bear witness? Why didn't you speak the word of Christ? And so I only say that because the Republican Party seems to me to be playing it safe. They want to carve out a losing position, and they're willing to sit on top in a losing position. And people who are the same establishment winners that have always been there here in Minnesota are the same establishment winners that have been there on the national scene. And I think a guy like Bannon laid this out well. Me and Bannon did an interview the other day, and Bannon had no problem coming out and saying, hey, listen, George Floyd was killed, but let's look at the circumstance of his life. His high-paying manufacturing job was sent to China, and this guy had no opportunity really he talked about opportunity. And there are many Republicans, especially here in Minnesota, that will hear a word like opportunity and immediately turn the light switch off. And to me, that's how we've lost any shot, at least up until now, to bring blacks, Hispanics, Somalis, whoever it is into the party. And the same. And I don't want to ramble here, but for all those out there who are talking about election integrity, don't let that be a scapegoat jerk off, right? I mean, I get it. The CIA, the intelligence community, there are many powerful institutions that both have the capacity to and the interest in tampering with elections or any level of politics, whether it be local all the way up to the president himself. So that potential is there. But let's not be mistaken.
Well, let me jump in there because I said
I want to finish this. Let's not be mistaken about the election integrity piece. There is a clear and calculable reason why the Republicans are losing in a place like Minnesota. They don't really want black people in the party. I mean, they talk about it. And then what really pisses me off is they bring a Kendall Qualls on stage. And I'm not saying anything personal about Kendall. I'm saying exactly what Mike Murphy said in front of the entire Republican State Convention. Hey, this guy's a sellout. Mike Murphy went on and said he may not want people to remember that. I remember it. I thought he was courageous, and I thought he was right as another black man. But the Republican Party is same with C.C. Davis. They bring these people on. But they're behind the closed doors making the same deals you're talking about that farmer makes with. It's the same run-of-the-mill thing. That doesn't represent black people, and black people know it. And there is a genuine black vote out there that doesn't want their kid masked, that doesn't want their kid to be forced to have a vaccine, that doesn't want their kid to have gender theory shoved down their throat. I mean, whatever you believe or not, they don't want it shoved down their kid's throat without their consent. There is a vote out there of Americans that we're not even reaching out to.
Let me jump in.
Yep.
I think one of the things the Republican Party has done is it's put up too many litmus tests, too many purity tests. You have to have this position on this position on this. The Democratic Party has done a better job of saying, you know what, at the end of the day, if you don't win elections, you're going to be unhappy. You got to win elections. And if you win elections, you might not be happy with 100% of what goes on, but probably 75%. So the Republicans have lost 30 statewide elections in a row. We in the party seem to have elevated the idea that when push comes to shove, take the moral high ground. Even if the moral high ground cannot be defined, you get to define it. So we've got people all over thinking they're taking the moral high ground, and they differ sharply. But all of these people are ideologically driven at that point in time, not coming together in those 90 days before the election, and we lose. I think that there's a tremendous number of people out there, and many black people that I met. If I had to characterize them, I would say they're not different than me. I would say they're socially moderate, fiscally conservative. I don't think we're selling that message in the Republican Party. We have got to be more socially moderate. We have to recognize that people, I remember when I did a radio program in North Minneapolis, and after we were done, we were out talking on the street, it was Black Republican, Black Democrat.
Yeah.
And we had the greatest conversation after the show was over out on the street when we talked about what would it mean to the black community in Northeast Minneapolis if marijuana were legalized. And I not only got an earful, I learned a ton. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I think that the Republican Party has got to be more willing to allow diversity of opinion within it. We don't all have to play at the 10-yard line. We want to play from the 5-yard line all the way to the 50-yard line, and we want to have an open enough mind that we can reach across the midline stripe and shake the hand of someone who actually lives on the left side of the field and say, hey, there's way more that we agree on than we disagree on. And that person on the left side, way down at the 5-yard line that wants to see America fail, you're not with that person. You're closer to me. We've got to start doing that. If we don't do that, we're just going to continue to lose statewide elections in Minnesota for sure.
And I want people to understand what you're saying here, and it's definitely what I'm trying to convey as well. Don't get us wrong. There's a person over on that left side of the aisle that does mean to undermine everything that is America: faith, family, community, fellowship. There is a person over there that does mean to undermine that. But it's not everybody. And it certainly isn't when it comes to the voter base. In fact, you could argue that one of the greatest campaign finance tragedies corruptions in this country is what mainstream liberal media is able to do in manufacturing consent of Democrat voters, where they think they're voting for one thing, but really they're getting something completely different. That's a Greek tragedy in and of itself, and the black community is at the front of the line when it comes to it. There is tons of people on the left side of the aisle that we should be able to work with. We show a real lack of discernment, faith, righteousness, when we create this litmus test and we say we can't nudge at all around any issue, because if we nudge at all around any issue, then we're going to concede every issue. That's kind of the Gazelka approach. He went a step before. He says you can't even talk about it, let alone start to cross the aisle. Because, and it's like and this is why I brought it up, because for those who don't want to consider the ramifications that marijuana and drug laws have had on young black men in this country, I kind of think you're a racist. I'm just going to say it. If you're a white man and you try to deny the categorical statistics about what marijuana laws or drug laws in general have brought down on the black community, you actually serve as the controlled opposition for the Democrats who want to undermine this country. It's strange. It's like they bait a hook, they set it out there, the Republican shallow thinkers bite on it, and we get stuck in the same place. Now, when you go to say, hey, God is fake. You can't to believe in God, to believe in Christ is white supremacy. That's a clear line we should be able to hold our position and feel confident about, like, not really seeing how they're going to infringe upon our right to have faith. Now, again, this line with the gender theory stuff is rubbing up against that, and I get that. But there's all kinds of issues out there that we need to deal with that aren't connected to that. Our monetary policy is one of them, and inflation and all these other things. We have to, at some point, have the confidence to walk across the aisle, to be able to go into the belly of the beast. That's why when we start the show, I say, I'm here in Minneapolis, the belly of the beast. We have to have that faith. And when you don't have that faith, it shows.
Perhaps one of the things I might just contribute as we get close to the end is sometimes you can't fix something until it's broken. Mm-hmm. And I think there were an awful lot of people thought that 2022 was going to be a red wave. Clearly, the overturning of Roe v. Wade had a profound impact on the nation's elections, including those in Minnesota. But I do think that people thought that we were poised to do far better than the conservatives did. Mm-hmm. And I think that the wake-up call that came in 2022 and watching what's happening now in 2023, as many pretty progressive liberal policies are being jammed down the throat, I think a lot of people are saying, okay, I got to rethink this. I got to stay engaged. I've got to ask myself some hard questions. To me, those are the ingredients for real problem solving. The Republicans have got to do some soul searching. The people on the street have to recognize that they don't get to sort of slide back onto the sidelines. This is, if you will, potentially one of the most critical, transformative moments in a history of our nation. It was one thing.
24, you mean? Or just this moment in general?
This moment right now in the 2020s, the COVID
2020,
pandemic.
22, and 24.
Yeah, and the COVID pandemic, mm-hmm. I think that what we've seen happen is, for all of us living through this time, I think you could go back and look at our nation's history, and certainly in 1776, there was a lot going on. And in 1861 with Civil War, there was a lot going on. And when we had the World War I and the World War II, and when we had the civil rights in the 60s, and then we got to a place in the 1980s and the 1990s where we had Reagan and Clinton. And right now, when you think back to those people, you say, that was a different time. We had the news being given to us by people like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather. We had politics far less involved. We had fourth grade teachers who were excellent, and the kids didn't even know if their teacher was Republican or Democrat. We really focused on the basics, and we were raising up a free society. We were leading freedom around the world. And then 911 hit. And then COVID hit. And COVID provides us with the lessons that we need to glean from. We need to recognize that you don't get to shut voices down, whether you're big tech and Twitter or Facebook or TikTok. You don't get to let big pharma run the whole nation, and you don't get big government continuing to grow larger and larger and larger, because we know that that's what Joe Rogan said something the other day that I thought was really good, Royce. Yeah. He said, what's happened? He said, the Democrats were always the party that was against censorship, and they were always a party that stood hard against the behemoth corporations. Why is it that the Democrats now seem to be so pro-pharma and so pro-censorship? What happened? Why did we not recognize that this complete paradigm shift has occurred? These are the kinds of things we have to noodle on as we move forward.
Well, actually, it's funny because I've been pondering the same thing, that the traditional Democrat position, the Kennedy Democrat, the Kennedy Democrat position would have been anti-war. It would have been anti-economic imperialism. It would have been anti-big corporations and crony capitalism. All of these things. All you can deduce from it, from my vantage point, is that that many of the Democrats, there was a Democrat position, and then there was a Democrat position under the surface, and that under the surface position craves tyranny. It wanted tyranny. And I would say it's the same thing for the Republican position. And many of the Democrats make fair points about Republicans' position on many things. It's like, you want small government, but you only want small government in the places you want it. It didn't work like that. If you want small government, shrink the government down. Don't come back to the town hall and tell us why. Well, we're going to have small government in all these places, but we're going to have it really big in these few select places, and they tend to benefit us. Right?
Let's unpack that one the next time we meet.
Let's do it. Well, thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Royce.
Doc, I appreciate it. The Teflon Doc, Dr. Scott Jensen himself, has come through the kangaroo proceeding from the Minnesota Medical Board and still gets to practice medicine. We appreciate your time today. All of the listeners and viewers out there, we appreciate your viewership and listenership today and in the future. This has been another episode of Please Call Me Crazy. The fight continues. Godspeed.